one thing that I'd want people to keep in mind when they're in a crisis is you've got to try and take the emotion out of it. And it's so easy for us to come in as an advisor, a crisis advisor, and say from the outside, look, you've got to stand up and apologise. You've got to cop this one on the chin. But I appreciate that if you're the business owner, if you're the CEO of an organisation, if the buck stops with you, that is, in practice, a really hard thing to do because there is pride on the line, there's honour on the line. You might be hesitant to do it because it's admitting you got it wrong. It's admitting you didn't hit your targets or your milestone. It's a really difficult thing to do. Anyone that's apologised, and we've all had to do it at different times in different scenarios, it's not easy.
Politicians, business owners, media professionals and sporting organisations. According to social scientists Karen Cerullo from Rutgers University and Janet Ruan of Montclair State University, who published the preeminent study on public apologies of the rich and the famous, these are the 4 professional groups who are most likely to have to issue or offer a public apology. And so chances are, if you're listening to this podcast at some stage through the next year, you will need to advise on, draft or offer an apology of your own. Now that the Australian business rhythms are back in full swing, the force of public apologies and their critics are now flowing at a steady pace. Today on Michelson Alexander Explains, we explore the good, the bad, and the, frankly, avoidant world of Apologies 101. And with me to do just that are Senior Associates Elyse Gatt and James Fitzpatrick. Thank you for your time today, guys.
Thanks for having us.
So to get the ball rolling, my very first question is an obvious one. What makes a good apology? And do you have an example that comes to mind?
Well, I'll start off with the research that you referenced in your introduction, Gordon, Cerullo and Ruan. When they analysed those 183 public apologies or celebrity apologies, or there were CEOs and executive business leader executives there as well, they found 5 key elements to an effective apology. So apologies that then led to a positive public sentiment on average after the apology was given. 5 key things. The first one was that the least effective apology is the offender-driven apology. So we've probably all heard it. It's one where a CEO or the celebrity will come out and talk about themselves in the apology. It's all about them rather than the victim or the person, the stakeholder that's been impacted by what's occurred. And they waste way too much time of the apology giving context, the background for why it happened. This is why the mistake was made. This is the background. This is the context. People don't care. They just want to hear you take responsibility and apologise straight up. The second thing that they found was that what you say first and what you say last in the apology are the most important bits. And that probably doesn't come as a surprise in the current age where people are consuming so much information, and we will often speed read emails, which is the format that you'll probably receive most of these apologies from, particularly if it's coming from a brand or an organisation. So what you say first frames where the rest of the apology is going. So that's a really important thing to get right. And then what you say last is what people will often retain. So nail those 2 bits and probably make sure your empathy or your understanding for the victim or your apology is in that first line, and then repeat it again in the last line. The sooner the apology was given, the more effective it was. And that's why we try and encourage businesses and leaders to apologise as quickly as possible, which is a difficult thing to do because you might not always have all the facts at hand. And we'll talk through some tactics later for how you can jump in before you have all the facts at hand. The fourth one was to apologise for what you did, not for what people felt. And this is a classic. So many people, I don't know where this line has come from, but so many people use the line, "I'm sorry you felt that way." That's not an apology. You're not apologising for something you did there. You're apologising for how someone else felt. What they found was that is not effective at all. So throw that line out. And then the last thing that was so important was you've got to, yes, apologise, but then you've got to explain how you're going to fix it and help ensure that it's never going to happen again. And Uber ran a great test a few years ago where they put different apology models to the test. So after someone receiving a poor experience with Uber, so maybe the driver was late or they went the long way round or something went wrong with your Uber experience, they tried different types of apologies in what they sent to the customer, the rider, after that experience. And they found that if they apologised straight up and offered compensation, there was then a positive correlation to people continuing to use Uber. If they didn't apologise at all, they found that there was a higher risk of people not using Uber after that incident. But then those that were still using Uber after receiving an apology started to come off if they kept having bad experiences with Uber. So yes, apologise, but you've also got to fix the problem. And so those were the 5 key things that Cerullo and Ruan found. Then in terms of like my favourite apologies, there's 2 that come to mind. The first one is Airbnb, a platform that we all know. There was some criticisms about racial profile and discrimination that was occurring on the platform. And Harvard did some research into it and found that travellers with distinctively African-American names in the US particularly were 16% less likely to be accepted as a guest to an Airbnb home relative to the identical guests with distinctively white names. That data was compounded on social media where people were giving their personal experiences of discrimination firsthand, and there were then a series of lawsuits against Airbnb. Now, it seems that they still haven't quite resolved this issue. It's really difficult, and a lot of it is outside of Airbnb's hands because these decisions are being made by owners of the homes on the platform. Even though the mistake was not necessarily at the heart of or in full control of Airbnb, they still came straight out. The CEO said, and one of the co-founders, Brian Chesky, came out and said, at the heart of our mission is the idea that people are fundamentally good. We don't say this because it sounds nice. It's a goal that everyone at Airbnb works towards every day. We've seen how we live together, better understand each other. Discrimination is the opposite of that, and its existence on our platform jeopardises our core mission, and they've got no place here. We've got zero tolerance for it. And then the key line. Unfortunately, we have been slow to address these problems, and for this I am sorry. And that I think is a really effective apology, because even though some of it's outside of their control, he's come out and said, look, we've got this one wrong. We've been slow to address this. We haven't responded to this well, and I'm sorry. No context, no further background than that, I'm sorry. The rest of the message then goes on to explain what they're doing about it. And there was a whole series of things that they put in place. They requested an investigation, a report, which then had a whole series of recommendations that they've been enacting ever since. So they apologised, and then they put in a plan to resolve it. The second one that I really like, and again, it goes to some of those points that Cerullo and Ruan found in their research for the most effective apology, was a platform in the US that users could use to book a doctor's appointment. And so often there were issues on the platform where doctors weren't updating their schedule, they weren't updating their calendar, as we know can happen from doctors. We've probably all had personal experiences of that, and that wasn't then being reflected in the platform. So users who had booked an appointment then found that appointment didn't actually exist, or there was an issue once they rocked up to the doctor's practice. Now, that's not the fault of the platform. Despite that, they realised that there was going to be an attribution of responsibility. And we know in situational crisis communication theory, it's not about whether you're actually at fault, it's whether there's a perceived fault. And if there is a perceived fault or a perceived responsibility on you, the organisation, it doesn't matter. The most effective strategy is to wear it and to apologise and to do something about it. So this platform came straight out, even though it was outside of their control, and to every user that had one of those scheduling issues, they said, look, we're so sorry this has happened. This is not why we set up this platform. We've got this wrong and we will address it. In the meantime, here is an Amazon gift card to help compensate some of the issue in scheduling and the wasting of your time, and we will work to get this right in the future. So I think those two are two of my favourites, because they took on a lot of those recommendations for the 5 things that you need to include in your apology, but they also took responsibility for issues that were slightly outside of their control. And that's the type of thing that I would recommend businesses and business leaders start to think about. Your attribution of responsibility, even if technically you're in the clear. You've got to think about how it looks to your customers, to your stakeholders.
There's a tendency to say, well, it wasn't our fault. We didn't cause this. Why should we have to apologise? And I think it's about thinking about the impact on your customers or any other stakeholders. So what is the impact of something that's happened that you are part of, and how would they attribute that blame to you? And I think then rather than thinking about apologies being about a direct line between something you've done and you having to apologise, it's something that's happened that you've had a part of that your stakeholders are going to attribute to you. And that's what's really great about both of those examples.
Elyse, I imagine you've probably been in a situation with advising many companies and leaders where they've been hesitant to apologise for something that's gone wrong. As we've just discussed, it might be that they weren't technically at fault. And there's often a number of people in that crisis room, from legal to ops to logistics to marketing, and then there's the comms person. And you're there to provide advice on what that CEO should do next. And there's obviously going to be a whole differing opinion in that room. I suspect we've probably got a few marketing and communications and media advisors listening into this podcast. What would your advice be to those people? For
me, it was having examples like the ones that you've presented to bring to a room, to say these are times where it hasn't been their fault, but they've had to apologise. And these are times, and having other examples where these are times where an apology wasn't given and it should have been and given later, and this was the impact of that. Legal especially will be the ones to say, we don't need to apologise, we don't have the facts yet. And I think we're coming to talk about this a bit later, but it's about getting in front of and saying we're aware that something's happened and we are looking into the matter, and we will come back to you with some information to give you that time to think about what your next steps are. But I think examples are really, really valuable with a CEO especially, because it can quieten the chatter of the rest of the room, who are all figuring out what their one tiny bit of the silo is, and whether they need to apologise.
There's a couple of points within that framework that you offered at the start there about an apology I'd like to dig into. And the first one I think is the most obvious one we just discussed then is guilt. Is an apology admittance of guilt? Does it need to be, and is there a risk that it can be misconstrued as such?
That's a really good question, and it's difficult. And this is the exact question that comes up in that crisis room, around that boardroom table quite often. And it often comes from the legal side. And the classic debate is you'll see the comms people and you'll see the legal heads going head to head on this exact topic. And, we're coming in with arguments about case studies and, look, long-term consequences associated to your brand and reputation for not apologising now. Yes, like maybe there's going to be an immediate lawsuit, but what about the long-term implications of absolutely ruining your brand and whether you can retain customers or generate new customers in the future? One of the interesting pieces of research around this has come out of the US. As a sociologist there named Ho, who found that this issue was quite prevalent in the medical sector in particular. So in the US, but you probably also see it in Australia and other Western countries, where there's this culture of litigation against doctors when something goes wrong. And things go wrong in hospitals all the time, unfortunately. It's the nature of the work that they do. And that by not apologising in that instance when something went wrong in a hospital scenario, you're potentially making the situation worse. And it's removing that whole restorative practice in going through that journey of healing with the victim of a situation. And so what Ho tested was that there were some states around the US that had removed the I'm sorry plea as an admission of guilt in court. So in those states, it allowed those doctors, and a few of them were trialling it allowed doctors to apologise, and for that apology then not to be used against them in court later. And in those states, they had some really, as Ho was researching this, they had some really interesting findings. So the states that had made this change to their law they saw a 20% increase in the speed of settlements in the medical sector, a 20,000 decrease in settlement size for minor injuries, and a 50 to 60,000 decrease in settlement size for major injuries. So Ho's conclusion was pretty clear. If you encourage people to say sorry, it's quite likely then that you're not going to then be looking at a lawsuit. And thankfully in Australia, from what I know, yes, you've got to do your own research, and yes, you need to have legal counsel, but it seems that the vast majority of time, you're not going to be like an I'm sorry or an apology is not going to be used against you in court if the facts show that there is no liability against you. So if ultimately there's no liability against you, there's no facts to prove that you're in the wrong, you should feel free to say sorry.
We're still speaking to other humans and thinking about your, instances where someone has wronged you. What do you want to hear? You don't need reparations. You don't need, revenge, I suppose. You want an apology. And I think if you bring it down to those base facts when you're thinking about how to act in a boardroom when there's a crisis, is what would you want to hear if something happened to you? And so I think taking that litigation away from it, obviously it's important, but comms people aren't lawyers, so we can't advise on that. Lawyers need to advise on whether there is is something that they can be sued for. Is there an actual fault that happened? We can advise on what the human response will be to an action by a company.
So then the second part was about timeliness of an apology. And so I think last year the most prominent example was organisations suffering from cyber security attacks. And like most of us didn't really know what to do or what was actually happening. And were kind of hesitant to say anything because they didn't really know what was going on. Is the timeliness or the need to apologise quickly more important than working out the facts? Or is it okay to be like, we're sorry, we don't actually know what's going on, but we're sorry that this experience hasn't been great for you?
I think this is where it comes, this is the basics of crisis communications, right? You talk about in crisis communications, it's the golden hour. You've got to get out there and say something in the first hour. And I think it's the same with apologies. You can say, we are sorry that something is happening. We don't have the facts yet. We will get the facts to you, but we understand that what our company has done has impacted you, and so we will do something about that. And timing is everything. Recent examples, it took companies days to apologise for data breaches, and there was this, and I think especially with the advent of social media, there was a building outrage that got louder than the actual issue. And I think that it's so important that you get in front of that outrage first, and that people can see that you're doing something.
The problem with not jumping onto the front foot and being the one to tell your stakeholders what's gone wrong and to apologise is that you run the risk of them hearing it from somewhere else. And I've been in a boardroom situation, I'm sure, Elyse, you've been in many, where they're like, oh, we'll just run the risk. How is anyone ever going to find out? Like, how would a journalist ever come across this story unless it was leaked? In my experience, people always find out. There are so many different ways for people to find out. Journalists will do the digging. Someone in your organisation will inadvertently let slip and it will come out. Mm-hmm. And I've hardly seen any cases where it doesn't. So I think you need to operate on the basis that it will come out. So don't run the risk of someone else being the person to tell your stakeholders what's gone wrong. And we use the case of a cyber attack that everyone should be preparing for now, or a data breach. If your stakeholders, your customers or your staff or your partners find out from the media or from someone else that you've lost control of their data, then you've also then lost full control of the narrative and the potential spiral of misinformation and gossip and hearsay that comes out of that. If you proactively take it on and are the ones to alert your stakeholders, even if you don't have all the facts yet, if you're the one to say, look, we're sorry for this disruption, but this is what we know now, this is what we don't know yet because it's still early, and this is what we're doing, and this is how we'll keep you informed, you hold full control then of the narrative and you limit the risk of misinformation being spread by other parties.
I've heard it around a boardroom being described as like, is this going to be an own goal? If we're the ones to announce that we've done the wrong thing, is this an own goal? Well, as you said, it always comes out. And what if it comes out in a year's time? That's even worse. It will, and I think that's exactly right. You have to go into that room just assuming it's going to come out. An own goal would be to not say anything and let someone else take control of the narrative completely.
Because you can also come out in a stronger brand and reputation setting than you started. So even if customers weren't going to find out, if they hear from you and you come across as being really proactive, it makes it look as if you are in full control of this incident type or this issue, that you are being so proactive, you're handling even the smallest of bin fires with full calmness, steadiness and control. You might then come out of it with customers thinking, hey, these guys are on top of it. Like, I know that was just a small little issue, but they just threw the kitchen sink at it. I now have full confidence in this organisation that if something really bad happened, that they're ready for it, they're prepared. If this is how they're going to respond to even the small incidents, wow, they're on top of it.
Is there such a thing in these situations as too much communication? And so I suppose part of the 5-step process there was to have a plan at the end. But some situations, and I suppose the cybersecurity one was potentially one where people unfortunately didn't have a plan in place prior and they're on the run with the situation. So perhaps they went and apologised as soon as they could, hit the golden hour, got ahead of the situation. But then obviously they need to communicate the rest of the facts when they come to hand and then communicate the plan because they need a plan to try and fix the situation. Is hitting those points at each individually too many points of communication and keeping you in the media or in communication with your stakeholders in for the wrong reasons? Or is it just a fact of all communication is good communication because you should be communicating with stakeholders?
Well, I'd answer that differently depending on the audience.
Yeah.
So with the media, I don't think you need to be going to the media every 10 minutes. With your affected customers or staff, I'd be getting out there early, and then I would have a reasonably frequent update, even if you don't have a lot of information. I'd lean on increase of frequency but less content. So I'm not suggesting that you send through, War and Peace every half an hour, but just even a couple of lines to say, this is the current update, this is what we're working through, if it's a live issue that's like quite serious. And then if you're worried about, hitting people's inboxes too much, like flooding them with information that might frustrate them, move then to saying from here on in, we're now going to post regular updates on this part of our website. And that might be a blog section, it might be a news section, or it might be a dark side of your website that you just switch on at a particular URL just for this incident type. And you say from here on in, we're now going to post updates every 2 hours and it's going to be on this section of our website. Then to all of your customers, to all of your staff and to the media, you can say, if you want updates going forward, head to this link. And you direct all people then to one source of the truth. So rather than trying to come up with all sorts of different communication types and through different mediums, you just direct people all back to that, you funnel them all back to that one source of the truth going forward.
If you had a spokesperson delivering an apology, I think that delivery has to be very tight. When giving an apology, a lot of people who are in the moment will start waffling and start offering a whole lot of information that's just not relevant, and you start looking like you're losing control, and it starts sounding like that your stakeholders will just start thinking that you're just throwing words at them to cover up the apology. Apologies need to be short and succinct and clear. Always answer the question where you can, like basic media training, but always go back to the apology and go back to, at the end of the day, I'm here to apologise and I'm here to rectify the situation. This is how I'm doing it.
And you mentioned there about spokespeople and in particular politicians, but also CEOs. We saw this, I think, with the Optus data breach, but are you apologising as like an embodiment of your organisation, or do you need to add like a personality or a personal persona? Are you apologising as yourself, who happens to be the CEO or the politician at the situation? You
will be apologising both on behalf of the organisation, but if you're the CEO, that's it. It's your responsibility. The buck stops with you as well. So you do have to offer a personal apology, and it does have to come from you. One thing that you need to be really careful about is watching burnout with your spokesperson. A really good example, and I'm pretty sure everyone would have seen this, is after the Gulf of Mexico incident at BP, the CEO at the time, Tony Wood, they did do apologies, and he stood up to do another apology at one stage, and he, having taken on so much responsibility of what was happening, as he should have, was starting to burn out. And he, at one stage, said,
"We're sorry for the massive disruption it's caused to their lives. And, there's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. I'd like my life back. So there's no one who wants this thing done more than I do. And we are doing everything we can to contain the oil offshore, defend the shoreline, and return people's lives to normal as fast as we can. And there's just no effort being spared in any dimension."
which completely eroded their entire apology and everything that they had done up to that stage. So I think, yes, CEOs do need to take responsibility and spokespeople need to take some kind of personal responsibility. You have to really make sure that the line is drawn so that they do not burn out.
That's a great point, and another reason why people should probably look at having multiple spokespeople and having your A team and your B team, the support team that can come in and provide relief to that crisis team and to that spokesperson. So I'd certainly recommend that organisations have multiple spokespeople trained so you can interchange between the two, because burnout in a crisis is a real risk and something that people often don't think about until it's too late.
And so my last question about these types of apologies in particular is that is it ever okay not to apologise? And so in your examples about good apologies, there were organisations taking responsibility for elements of a situation that were probably beyond their control, using probably both your traffic light crisis communications system but also your 5-step apology model. Is there ever a time where it's okay for an organisation to say, no, yes, there's a situation going on, yes, it's controversial or we're in the media, but we don't need to or should apologise?
There is. And what I would recommend looking at here is a theory called situational crisis communication theory. It was developed by a person named Coombs several years ago, and it's used by crisis communicators around the world ever since and still holds true. In situational crisis communication theory, the basis is that you use a matrix similar to a risk assessment table that everyone's probably seen, and it's traffic light systems, green, amber, red. And it helps you by asking a number of questions at each stage to help you identify what your attribution of responsibility is. And we'll go back to a point that we've made before. That attribution of responsibility is not whether you are technically in the wrong, but it's whether your stakeholders think you're in the wrong, if there's a perceived guilt, or if they think you should be taking responsibility regardless, if the buck stops with you in their mind. So in Coombs' situational crisis communication theory, you answer those set of questions. Initially, what type of incident it is, whether you're at fault, whether you're the victim. Maybe it's a natural disaster that's affected your organisation. Well, it's not really your fault unless you haven't prepared for it. But then there's other types in the amber or the red where you've got, perhaps it was an accident, but you probably could have done more to prevent it or respond to it, or maybe there was more training that was needed for your staff. That's where you're sitting in the amber. And then the red is where, well, no, there's actually been malpractice. Like you've done something wrong here, and that's a clear apology. And for each of those levels, then there is a certain type of apology and then a certain type of communication tactics that you can use. And I would recommend, rather than just operating on gut feel, like a lot of communicators do, actually use a matrix like that. You can have your own one, you can build your own style, but along similar lines that in the heat of the moment, when there's lots of emotion, there's lots of things going on, use a template like that to determine, okay, here are the facts. Well, based on that, even though emotionally we feel like we're not in the wrong, we're still in the amber. We're going to have to apologise. But if you're in the green, that's a situation where perhaps you don't need to apologise. Maybe it's a natural disaster, or maybe it's completely false, what's spreading around the media. Well, that's when you can hit back and you don't need to apologise. And that's absolutely the right tactic. The one thing to keep in mind, and this should be included in your process and your matrix, is yes, you answer those first set of questions about where you're sitting on that attribution responsibility, but also consider intensifying factors. Has this accident, if it's just an accident, occurred before? Is this like the 5th time you've been hacked? Even though, yes, you're the victim of the hack, but really your customer's the actual victim, and you probably should have protected yourself a little bit better. This is now the 5th time, as an example. Are there broader things going on in society? Is there a broader context that adds an intensifying factor? And again, to go back to cyber attacks, right now there is a whole lot of conversations in the media and in the public discourse about cyber attacks. And if you get hacked tomorrow and it comes out that you had not protected yourself at all, there is no way that an organisation, after what's happened over the past 2 years, can come out and say, oh, we didn't realise there was a risk of us being hacked, so that's why we didn't have adequate defence. That's just not going to fly. Because of the broader context at the moment, everyone knows that they're at risk, so they should be preparing. So it's that style of matrix that I recommend following to help you determine situations where you can perhaps not apologise or hit back, or situations where you're in that amber or that red, or there's intensifying factors where you do need to lean straight into that apology.
You mentioned we should start and end with the most important parts of an apology. We'll do the same with the podcast. What is one key takeaway that a business or an organisation or a leader of any sort should consider with regards to making public apologies?
If you were to take away one lesson or one thing that I'd want people to keep in mind when they're in a crisis, is you've got to try and take the emotion out of it. And it's so easy for us to come in as an advisor, a crisis advisor, and say from the outside, look, you've got to stand up and apologise. You've got to cop this one on the chin. But I appreciate that if you're the business owner, if you're the CEO of an organisation, if the buck stops with you, that is in practice a really hard thing to do, because there is pride on the line, there's honour on the line. You might be hesitant to do it because it's admitting you got it wrong. It's admitting you didn't hit your targets or your milestone. It's a really difficult thing to do. Anyone that's apologised, and we've all had to do it at different times in different scenarios, it's not easy. What I would implore executives to do is just to try and take the emotion out of it and think as much as possible, and Elyse touched on this many times, you've got to think about the victims and the stakeholders. You've got to put yourself in their shoes. Don't talk about your business. Don't talk about the whys and the context and the background. Think about them as the victim, not your business as the victim. And cyber attacks are a great example. Yes, your organisation was hacked, but you're not really the victim. Your victim is the customer or the staff members whose data has now been released into the wild. So one thing I want people to take away, take out that emotion and just look at the data and all the evidence we've presented to you in this podcast. It all shows that if you cop it on the chin, if you take responsibility, and if you do that proactively and quickly, you have a really good opportunity and a really high chance of coming through this, not only by being able to manage the crisis well and instill confidence within your customers. You might even come out of it stronger, with a stronger personal reputation as an executive or a leader, and a stronger business reputation than you started.
Time is not on your side with an apology. You can apologise at any time, but the sooner that you do it, the more control you have over the narrative, and the more control you have over the situation, and potentially the more respect your stakeholders will have for you in the long run, and the more you can protect your brand. So take the time and do the work and speak to your comms people, but it's got to be something you get on too fast.
Now it's our turn to apologise to our listeners, because that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, Elyse and James, for your time. And thank you to everyone who's been listening. Make sure you subscribe to Michelson Alexander Explains on YouTube or your podcast platform of choice. And if you have a topic or area that you'd be liking us to cover sometime in the future, let us know by leaving us a comment or a review. Thank you.